The difference between obsessive compulsiveness we discussed yesterday and normality and balance is perspective. If you focus onto anything with a microscope, you become obsessive compulsive. If you zoom out and you see the context, then you become much more balanced and normal. And it's really important that as we journey through our avodat Hashem, our growth in serving Hashem, that we improve in our quality of service of Hashem, but not in an obsessive compulsive way, in a way where we're able to keep that balance and perspective as we go, that we're able to understand everything that we're learning and everything that we're doing in the broader context of our understanding. And that's part of the purpose of the Matmonim Shiurim. They are not just to explain a specific piece of Gemara. The purpose of the Matmonim is also over a period of time to build up a worldview, to build up a way of understanding context, a framework through which to understand the Torah and the life that we're living. And it's in the area of food that the biggest opportunity for obsessive compulsiveness exists. I think that psychologists might agree that that's true in the area of psychology, and it's true in the area of halakha as well. You don't find people becoming obsessive compulsive about the laws of chesed, or of the laws of Lashon Hara. Maybe the Chofetz Chaim was a little bit, I don't know. But most people are not obsessive compulsive about those things. But when it comes to food, there's incredible opportunity for obsessive compulsive personalities. And there's also the opportunity for majestic perspective, if we understand what it really all means and where it comes from. My friend Rav Yitzchak Lifshitz, I've spoken to him about him to you before, an amazing human being. He's a Rav, he's a Rosh Yeshiva, he's a posek, he's a professor at Shalem, he's a musician, he's an artist, he's a poet, he's a chef, he's one of these Renaissance human beings, just an incredible human being. And here are two very important sforim. The one on Hilchos Shabbos, Raza de Shabso, and the other one is recently published, I've referred to it before, is Mibsari Zeh. And part of his purpose there is to show how the laws of kashrut, the laws of Issur veHeter, are part of an avodas Hashem. What is the avodah? It's not just about not eating treif. So I didn't eat anything treif. Everything I ate today was kosher. There's an avodah, there's a service of God in every step of keeping the laws of kashrut, and that's really the purpose of his sefer. And one particular chapter in his sefer is the foundation of what we're going to learn today. The laws of Issur veHeter, the laws of kosher and treif, is not only about the substance of the food. We've talked about that for often as well, and we talked about it yesterday. It's even more about the act of eating and the meaning attached to that particular action. So we learned yesterday that Chamira Sakanta Issur, which sets the foundation at the very beginning of the sugya that kosher and treif is not medicine and it's not chemistry. If you're dealing with health issues, we're much more machmir, we're much more meticulous, because there it's either yes or no. There's place to be compulsive. If there's a chashash, there's a concern. There's this ship floating around now with this horrible virus that's killing people. If there's a concern, God forbid, that the food that you're about to eat could have been contaminated by that virus that is on that ship, believe me, we're going to be obsessive compulsive. With COVID, we were obsessive compulsive. When it comes to health, we're obsessive compulsive. Kashrus is not chamira. It's not as chomer as sakanta. We deal with kashrus differently. It's not that we take it lightly. It's just a different system of working. It's not about chemistry. It's not about science. It's about the relationship between us and the things that we're eating. And we learned yesterday also the whole idea of chazaka, which we use so much, which we learned from the case of the Kohen who leaves the house, closes the house, assuming that the nega, the blemish that he found on the house, has not got any smaller than it was when he last saw it. That's a chazaka. We also learned the fact that when he looks at those blemishes, he's not allowed to use artificial light or even natural light from the outside, from the sun. If that's not part of the natural light of the enclosure, of the room, of the house in which he's looking, it's got to be by the naked eye, as Rashi brings, because it says, Kenega nir'eh li bevayit li velo le'ori. I saw the nega. This is about the Kohen and his visual experience of the nega. It's not about the science and the math and the geometry of the nega. If you're standing in a dark place and you need a candle, you need a torch, a flashlight in order to be able to see the nega, that doesn't count. That's not, and that's foundational to the way we look at the whole thing, which brings us to the psak of Rav Moshe Feinstein and many others, where Rav Moshe says very clearly in Yoredei Chelik Beis in Kuf Mem Vav, Lo asra Torah ela tolaim ushkatzim u'ramasim shenir'u le'einayim. The Torah only forbids those bugs in fruits and vegetables that are visually visible, that you can see with the naked eye. You don't use microscopes and you don't use magnifying glasses. So what does that mean, as we mentioned yesterday? Does that mean that there isn't a microscopic bug there? No, says Rav Moshe Feinstein. There's a microscopic bug in every glass of water you drink, in every breath of air that you breathe. The microscopic bugs are not treif. There's nothing wrong with microscopic bugs. Enjoy them, eat them, have them, do what you want with them. They're not a problem. The problem are bugs that you can actually see. And as the Rambam brings la halacha, even among bugs it depends. There's a difference the Rambam learns between something which is romeis ala aretz and something which is a sheretz ala aretz. Two different kinds of bugs. There are situations where you could have a bug in a fruit, and you can even see the bug visually, but it's a kosher bug. You're allowed to eat it. It's not so simple that all bugs are also. There's a lot of halacha involved in that. And he goes on to say that clearly you don't even need to bring rayas. The person he's writing to, Rav Moshe Feinstein, brings all sorts of proofs for this. He says, you don't need proofs. This is a din barur ufashut shelo shayach listapek klal. You don't need any. There's no doubt about this. You don't have to bring proofs about this. And also you've got to be aware, he says, if you'll say, but let's be machmir. Okay, I understand that you don't have to use a magnifying glass, but I want to be particularly careful. Let me use a magnifying glass when I'm checking my lettuce. No, says Rav Moshe, because kol adorot hakshirim hagonim v'atzadikim v'achasidim lo yishtamshu b'mikroskop. All the previous generations didn't use microscopes and magnifying glasses. We've learned how the tzaddikim of previous generations didn't do anything wrong, even ba'onis, even without intention, even situations of honest, they're protected from that. So what are you going to say? I look at it with a microscope, but the Chofetz Chaim or the Shach and the Taz or the Rambam, or Ravina and Ravashi, they used to eat bugs because they didn't have microscopes. They didn't look at it with microscopes. Sometimes when we're machmir, when we become overly meticulous, even in laws of Issur veHeter, included in that meticulousness, we are also doing something wrong, because we're implying that what went before was inadequate. We're making a statement about those who went before. And so we have to be careful that what we do, yes, sometimes there's new technology that enables us to do various things, but we have to be very careful that we don't use that to define halakha. Halakha is defined by the Torah, and it's defined for the human being. It's not defined for machinery, it's not technology, it's humanity. It's human experience. It's not seeking perfection in an object. It's seeking perfection in the human experience and the way the human expresses his life and his actions. And that, although Rav Yitzchak Lipschitz doesn't say that in his introduction, but if I remember correctly, when we talked about it, he mentioned that's part of the reason he called it Mibsari Erzeh Eloka. The pasuk from Iyov, it doesn't mean exactly that in the context of the pasuk, but he's using the phrase, I experience God Mibsari, through my flesh. I don't experience God through a microscope. I don't experience God through a laboratory. I experience Hashem in the way I experience Him, mibsari, with my own flesh and blood as a human being. That's where I experience Hashem. And again, his point is that in kashrus and the laws of kashrus, there's an avodah. And part of the avodah is to align ourselves with what Hashem finds disgusting. And to understand and to be able to feel, shaketz t'shaktzenu, that there are things that we need to find disgusting, although we might not instinctually find them disgusting. Or there might be things that we instinctually find disgusting, but they're not disgusting to Hashem in halakha. We've got to be able to align ourselves to how Hashem wants us to experience the world. That's foundational to the principles of kashrus. Now we move on Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, where there's a terribly important Rashi that is really the foundation of a lot of things that we're going to deal with. What Rashi deals with is based on the principle of Rov. So now we have a principle of Rov, you can rely on a majority. Does that mean that you know for sure that what you're eating is not an object that on its own would be treif? Absolutely not. On the contrary, there's a chance that what you're eating is not technically kosher. But in the act of eating, you're allowed to eat that with the full engagement of eating something that is kosher. So the example we gave, you find a piece of meat, there are only 10 shops, 9 of them are kosher, 1 of them is not kosher, there's nowhere else the meat could come from. You can eat the meat, although you don't know for sure. There's no certainty, but there's certainty in the way you live and the way you experience that act of halakha. Based on Rov, as I said to you, we don't, for example, we don't worry about drinking milk and think maybe it comes from a cow that wasn't kosher. That would be a problem. No, most cows are kosher, so we go with the Rov. Does that mean we know for sure? No, we don't know for sure. But we do know for sure that the halakha is we can drink the milk. In the same way, the halakha is, although there are 18 potential problems with an animal's organs that can cause the animal to be treif, if after the animal is killed you find any one of these 18 problems in one of its organs, the animal is treif. But we don't check for them. We assume the animal is treif unless we find them, unless we come across it, but we don't go looking for it. However, there's one exception to that. We do check the lungs of an animal. And this is something that the Rishonim here get very interested in. Either way, if we rely on a Rov, if we rely on a majority, then why do we check lungs? If we don't rely on the majority, why don't we check all 18 treifot, all the 18 possibilities of treif, what really is going on? So Rashi says, clearly the law of following a majority is halacha l'Moshe misinai, or it comes from acharei rabim lahatot. It's not from all the cases the Gemara brings. The Gemara brings lots of cases in the Torah, and in each one, we could say that those are situations where Rabbi Meir would say, Efshar livdok, these are situations where you are able to check. If you're able to check, you check. So in that case, Rashi says, why do we ever follow Rov in situations where technically you could check? You could open every animal after it's shechted and check every one of its organs. And we don't do that. Why don't we do that? Because either there's a halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai, Hashem taught Moshe on Sinai, or we follow the principle of acharei rabim lahatot, follow a majority, the Torah tells us, whether it's a ruba de ita kaman or a ruba de leta kaman, as we discussed yesterday, whether it's talking about a majority of judges on the Sanhedrin, or we're talking about a majority of stores, of butcher shops in the town, or whether we're talking about a statistical majority. In either case, we're allowed to follow the Rov. And therefore, we don't have to worry. And that's why we don't check all the 18 different types of treifot. But what about the lung? The lungs are checked. That's an important part of the shechita process. And when you see different levels of kashrut, it's mahadrin, it's not mahadrin, it's glat, it's not glat, the differences very often are around the thoroughness with which the lungs are checked. Ask Rashi, why are you checking lungs at all? The majority of cows are healthy. But we do, because shchiach ba'reuta. Rashi introduces a new idea, which comes from a Gemara in Nido, which, yes, the minority of cows or oxen have problems with their lungs, but it's a relevant minority. This is a new idea. We don't find so clearly articulated. Here's the sugya where it really is introduced. Mi'ut hamatzui, it's called, as the Ramban calls it, we'll see in a moment. This is called a relevant minority. So it's not just majority or minority. If the minority is relevant and there's a way to check it, we check. And it's the Ramban here who asks the same question about why do we check lungs, and he answers similarly to Rashi, ve'en somchim lechatchila al harov bedavar shemi'uto matzui. And mi'uta matzui, when you find a relevant minority, we don't rely on rov. We don't rely on a majority. So how many animals have problems with the other 17 treifot, the other different organs that could have problems? That's a very small minority. But the lungs is more frequent. In certain parts of the world, it's even more frequent than others. What is a mi'ut hamatzui? This is the interesting thing. It doesn't say anywhere. What is relevant? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 30%? Is it 5%? There's no reference. Everything else we've got numbers for. How much is a kazayas, and how much is a kebetza, and how many saw is a mikveh, and how many amos can you walk on Shabbos? Everything there's a measure for. A mi'ut hamatzui, nobody says what the measurement is. Why? It has always bothered me. It's such a mystery. Why would it not be? It's not in Shulchan Aruch, it's not in the Rambam, it's not in the Gemara, it's nowhere. Is there a mention, a determination of what a relevant minority is? And there's a famous tshuva of the Mishkanos Yaakov, who was a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who works it out to be 10%. And a lot of them question it. Some say it should be more than 10%. I find it difficult because from the Gemara in Nida, where this idea of a mi'uta de lo shchiach comes up, we're talking about it according to the shit of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, you remember, doesn't work with Rov. He's very, very concerned even about minorities. And the Gemara there discusses about whether in the case of Yevomus, we learned it back in Yevomus, one should worry about an underage brother and sister-in-law who want to get together to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum, but you don't know, they might turn out to be sterile. And if they turn out to be sterile, then the Yibum wasn't Yibum and there was an Issur of Eishes Ach. It becomes very serious. So do we wait until they're older to check whether they're sterile or not, which is what Rabbi Meir requires? Or the Chachamim say, no, there's a Rov, you can rely on the Rov. And the Gemara discusses there, but what about Rabbi Meir? He's worried about a miut. Is this a miut de lo shchiach? And Rabbi Meir says, no, this is a miut de shchiach. This is a relevant miut, it's a relevant minority. Well, how many children turn out to be sterile? And nowadays they make themselves sterile because they mess around with their genders. But in those days, there were what was it, 10% of people turned out to be sterile? It would be doubtful. So it doesn't seem to be specifically 10%. What is this magical number that doesn't exist? So Rav Lipschitz has an amazing approach to it, based on his whole approach to Chullin and to Yoredea. So he writes, and I quote pieces of this because they're so important. Ein bidvarim tzivat iver lihimanut bilvad ela tzivui al hayachas ela maasim halalu. What's important in Yoredea and in Chullin, there's not a blind instruction to refrain from eating certain things, but it's about the relationship to the action of eating those things. This is not about not ingesting certain treif things. We see that's not what it's about. It's about the act of eating something which the Torah, which Hashem has classified as sheketz, as something which you should distance from yourself. It's the act of eating which is the poison to the neshama. Maaseh bal mashmaut, an act of meaning. Kol ma shekatan michdei zihui ba'ayin eno kayam bibchinat din Torah. We see that anything which is too small for the natural eye to identify doesn't exist halachically. It exists scientifically, but it doesn't exist halachically. It has no relevance halachically. The fact that you can notice a bug if you use a magnifying glass, that doesn't make it disgusting. Something is disgusting if you see it and it disgusts you or it disgusts Hashem. But if you need a magnifying glass, you don't have to search for it in order to become disgusted. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah says if you see it, it should disgust you the way Hashem wants it to disgust you. But you've got to use your natural eyes. And therefore, kashe la'amod al kiyumo shel ha'Issur, hanefesh mit'alemet mikiyumo v'u'enenu kayam ledido shel ha'adam. If the soul can't see, if the person is not existentially aware of the Issur, it doesn't exist in the area of Issur veHeter. Lachen advarim einot tluyim b'misparim. So this is not about numbers. This is not about percentages. This is not about the technology of food. This is about the human experience. Ela b'sheila ad kama Issur kayim b'shvil ha'adam. The question is, how much is this Issur actually present for the human being? Kol od medubar b'miut, as long as we're talking about a minority and not a majority. And therefore he comes to the conclusion that miut ha'matzui is very subjective. It depends what Issur you're talking about. It depends what situation you're talking about. Is it something you're concerned about? And that level of whether or not you're concerned about fluctuates. As we said, in the case of a dangerous virus of sakona, we would be worried about the slightest possibility. Anything would be called a miut ha'matzui. You're talking about something that's less severe. There's a virus around, but it's not very serious. You get a cold at worst. We're not so careful about it. That's in the area of sakana. In the area of Issur as well, this idea of miut ha'matzui is deliberately not enumerated because it's got to be experienced. It's about the way you experience it. And it's interesting that the same idea was already expressed by Rav Shaul Yisraeli. Rav Shaul Yisraeli is an underrated Gaon, an incredible posek from a few decades ago. The reason he's underrated is because he was part of the Dati Leumi society. He was part of the modern Orthodox Zionist movement, and in those days there was very little communication between that. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Merkaz Harav, he was a Talmud of Rav Kook. There was very little interaction, and so he's somewhat ignored in the area of Psak, but he wrote some amazing tshuvas. And he writes, in fact, as well, on mi'ut hamatzui, mizeh nireh she'ein lachmir b'chaganda el hadavar nitan lahachra l'chol echad lefi hargashato shirchak hasafek milibo. When you're talking about mi'ut hamatzui, what's important is that you feel, as a posek, I feel this is nothing to worry about. That's the point. We're talking about a mi'ut. We're talking about, the only thing we're talking about, is it a mi'ut hamatzui, is it not a mi'ut hamatzui? We're not talking about whether it's, of course, if it's a majority or a near majority, it's different. But if we're just looking at the question of, is it a mi'ut hamatzui or not, there's a reason why a number wasn't given. He claims the reason is because this varies by situation, it varies by circumstance, it varies by society, it varies by posek. And you need a posek who's able to say, looking at the whole perspective, looking at it, zooming out, for me, this is not something I'm terribly worried about. And then it's not a mi'ut hamatzui. If it gets to something where he feels this is something to be concerned about, I see a lot of these cases, then that becomes a mi'ut hamatzui, and it's something one has to be concerned about. Rav Lifshitz ends with a very beautiful metaphor where he says, if you tune a piano using an instrument, a tuning instrument, a scientific instrument that measures the frequencies, if you tune a piano with that, a musician will tell you it's out of tune, because the human ear is not perfect. And perfect tuning has to match the human ear, not the science. And that's how it is in halacha. When we deal with Hilchos Issur veHeter within the frameworks of halacha that we've discussed and we've decided, there are areas in the Hilchos Issur veHeter where we've got to look not at the perfection of the object. Don't bring your microscopes out to decide whether this is a bug or not. At the end of the day, there's a human experience. Is this shaketz to shaktzenu or not? What are the halachic requirements? Does this fit the halachic requirements? And the halachic requirements are that it should be visible with the naked eye, as Rav Moshe Feinstein paskins very clearly, because at the end of the day, this is about how the human interacts with the world. The Shulchan Aruch, and particularly Yoredeh, is not about the world. It's about how we react with the world. That's why it's not a science and it's not about health. The laws of kashrus are not about the world. The laws of kashrus are how we interact with the world. And this is something we need to absorb in all aspects of our lives, not to become so obsessed with the technical that we lose sight of the human experience. You can be listening to a beautiful piece of music and you're obsessed with the fact that there's a crackle on the hi-fi. That you're obsessed with the fact that the amplifier is not perfect. You're obsessed with the fact that the speakers aren't as great as they could be. Listen to the music. What are you feeling? What are you experiencing? And we do that in all areas of our life, no less in halakha, and particularly, as we said, food is the area of the biggest possibility for obsessive compulsiveness. While we have to be very meticulous about the halachot, don't lose sight of the human experience of the act of eating and the way we serve Hashem through the way we eat.